The creepy persistent ghost. "I'm sorry if I'm such a pain," Mr. Sidney said as I adjusted his pillows with a sigh. "Oh. It's not you, I promise," Janet exclaimed. "I just have some things on my mind." "They don't seem to be happy things," Mr. Sidney noted with a wheeze. "Is it all this taking care of dying folks that has you upset? Or is it something else? I have a hard time talking, but I can be a great listener if you want to talk about it." Janet smiled. Mr. Sidney had always been one of the kindest men she cared for in the old age home where she worked. It was hard to believe that this weathered whisper of a man used to be a great muscled boxer in his day. He often spoke of how he was going to get back all those muscles when he got to heaven. He believed your spirit would look like your body did when you were in your prime. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," Janet exclaimed with a sigh. "Try me," Mr. Sidney wheezed. "I'll bet it's something about too many young men asking for such a lovely hand." I had to smile at his compliment. "You don't know how close you are to the truth," Janet replied. "Why don't you finish your rounds and then come back and tell me about it?" He insisted. "It would make a dying man happy to have a bit of company." "All right," Janet said, already a little brighter. "Perhaps it will help to get it out in the open. I'll be back in half an hour." The time and chores flew by quickly. As she neared his room, Janet found herself hoping that she would not find Mr. Sidney asleep, or even worse. She was in luck. He was propped up in bed, eagerly awaiting their conversation. "Okay," Janet started after she had made sure he was comfortable. "You're going to find this a bit hard to believe, but I promise I'm telling the truth." Janet took a deep breath, wondering if she should go on. Mr. Sidney smiled and nodded his encouragement. "Now if you tell anyone about this, I swear I will say you aren't right in your head and it never happened. Understood?" Mr. Sidney gurgled a giggle. "I understand," he said with a smile. "Very well," Janet continued. "I'm being haunted by a ghost." Mr. Sidney immediately dropped his smile, and stared at her intently. "I swear," Janet insisted. "You see, he only haunts me when I like someone and maybe I'd better start at the beginning." The smile came back to Mr. Sidney's lips. Janet took a deep breath for courage, and plunged into her story. "I met Robert when I was just 18. We met through mutual friends. I had seen him watching me at a party, so I wasn't surprised when he asked me out. We went to dinner, and then afterwards went for a long walk on the beach. The walk was his idea. I kind of figured out over dinner that he wasn't the man for me, but he didn't get the same information. I think he was totally smitten with me." "That's not hard to understand," Mr. Sidney said when I paused. "Please, go on." "Well, Robert called me several times after that. I told him that I just wanted to be friends. He said he was a big boy and could handle that, but I knew he wanted more. He would find excuses to bump into me, and then would sit and talk for an hour. It was tiring, but I didn't know what to do. Anyway, about 3 months after our date, Robert was killed in a car crash. Oddly enough, it happened right outside the door to my apartment. I was sad, of course, but got over it pretty quick. After all, Robert didn't really mean that much to me. But even in death, Robert wouldn't leave me alone. He would show up in my room every so often, and then stay and talk for an hour. People were starting to think I had lost my mind. They would hear me talking to him, but of course, they only heard my half of the conversation. I kept trying to tell Robert the first wasn't in love with him, but he kept insisting that I was, but I just didn't realize it yet. He was patient and would wait, he said. Only he wasn't that patient, especially when I would find someone I was interested in. Whenever I went out on a date, Robert would come along. No one could see him or hear him but me, but it was infuriating. He would sit there, and make snide comments about the man I was with. If that didn't work, he would make sure something went wrong. He would tip a drink into the man's lap, or try to knock over his chair. He kept saying how proud he was that he had mastered moving objects in his ghostly state. As you can imagine, No one ever asked for a second date. And now it's about to happen again. You see, there's this guy that I have admired for a long time. He's a friend of a friend. He's really nice, and so gentle and kind." Janet stopped as she realized she was gushing. "Anyway, he finally asked me out for this Friday. I immediately said yes and was really excited to go. Now I'm thinking I should cancel. I know Robert will be up to his old tricks. He showed up in my bedroom for the last 3 nights, and told me his plans for what he's going to do to Harry. Now I don't know what to do." Janet ended almost in tears. Mr. Sidney reached forward and patted her hand softly. "Would you like me to see if I could do anything?" he asked gently. "What could you do?" Janet asked. "Even if you still had all those muscles you had when you were a boxer, your fists would go right through Robert. He's nothing but air." "Perhaps I could talk with him," Mr. Sidney said. "I think I know of a way." Janet smiled. "That's right. Mrs. Mooney fancies herself a medium," Janet exclaimed. "Perhaps she could summon the ghost of Robert, and you could give him a talking to." I left Mr. Sidney's room all excited. Mr. Sidney never got the chance to work with Mrs. Mooney. That very night he passed away quietly in his sleep. When Janet heard the news the next day, she was glad she had taken the time to talk to him. She would have always regretted leaving a client alone during his last hours when he wanted company. The rest of the week was a bit of a blur. It was hard to focus when you got very little sleep at night. Even on the nights that Robert didn't show up, she would lie awake waiting for him to appear. Before she knew it, Friday came. Janet was about to call Harry and cancel their date, but suddenly he called her. "I just wanted to confirm that I would be picking you up at 6 o'clock tonight," he said. As soon as she heard his voice, Janet couldn't stop herself. "I can't wait," she admitted. "Great," he answered. All the way through getting ready that evening, Janet had worried. She finally resolved to completely ignore Robert, no matter what he did or said. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but maybe it would get rid of him if she pretended she couldn't see him anymore. At first it worked. She truly didn't see Robert anywhere. But just as she entered the restaurant on Harry's arm, she knew her luck had run out. There was Robert waiting just inside the entrance. True to her idea, she completely ignored him as they waited to be seated. "This is the boob you've been wanting to date," Robert whispered in her ear. What a sorry excuse for what passes as a man. Why, he's probably no good at any sports, much less the ones that count. He probably even thinks he's smart. Robert scoffed. Janet looked in the opposite direction, as though she couldn't see or hear Robert. She could tell that ignoring him made Robert angry, but it was the only choice she had. Robert took a great breath and knocked Harry's tie askew. It flapped up and covered his face. Spare the world having to look at that ugly mug, would. What the? Suddenly Robert stopped. Janet could tell he was flustered. "I think the lady has told you that she does not prefer your company," came a familiar voice. Janet swung around to look. There was Robert, standing next to Harry, but suddenly he wasn't alone. Right off his shoulder was Mr. Sidney, looking happy as a clam, if a bit see-through. Janet couldn't help but smile as she noted Mr. Sidney's form. He was right. You did get all your muscles back when you went to heaven. Shall we step outside? She heard him say softly. He grasped Robert by the arm. Robert's face showed the fear he felt as the two forms slowly faded out the door. Somehow Janet knew she would never be bothered by Robert's ghost again. Before going on, if you like these stories, do hit the like button, subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification bell, so you will not miss new stories like this. The Transparent Ghost. I got my bike at a police auction. I thought it looked like a fantastic piece of machinery. The cops had said it was abandoned, but I couldn't believe it. Why in the world would anyone abandon an incredible bike like this? But let me start at the beginning. When I was 12, my parents bought me a new bike. It was a bit big for me at the time, but they kept insisting that I would grow into it. Within a year or so I did. That's when I figured out why they had gotten me something bigger instead of a bike my size. They actually expected me to keep what they bought until I had finished college, and could afford to buy something on my own. Well, I wasn't going to wait that long. As soon as I was 14 I got a job delivering newspapers. Then to earn a bit more I offered to deliver groceries and do shopping for people who had a hard time doing it. It killed my social life for a year, and somehow the money never added up as fast as I expected it to. Finally I realized I was never going to be able to buy the 10-speed mountain bike that I wanted. Then one day when I was 15, I saw this ad for a police auction. They were selling off all sorts of stuff. The flyer listed everything you could think of, and down near the bottom it listed what I wanted. Bicycles. There was a number to call on the flyer, so I did. I got some nice officer on the phone and she told me everything I needed to know, including that there were hundreds of bicycles. I figured out of hundreds I could find something I liked better than what I had. My parents knew how much I wanted a new bike, so my dad agreed to take me to the auction. I had brought along all the money that I had and knew that I had almost $60 to spend. Then at the last minute, my mom slipped me another $10 bill, just to help out. I figured that much should get me something. We got to the police station and I couldn't believe my eyes. It looked like there were thousands of bikes. Some of them were beat up and not worth taking home, but there were a lot of them that I thought would be great. There was even this really fancy one that I knew would be way out of my range. It was my dream bike, an X314. It was a 10-speed mountain bike that had everything on it. It had a few dents and dings in it, but it looked like it could get run over by a tank and still be ridden. Of course I knew that one would go for far more than what I had. When the auction started it was pretty exciting. Things moved really fast. I'm glad we got there early so I could just watch for a bit before they got to the bicycles. When they did, I thought I was ready. The auctioneer would start his fast talking, and I held up my hand. The guy actually pointed to me. Then he pointed to someone else, then someone else. I couldn't quite understand what the guy was saying, but a moment later he looked at me again. I started to put my hand up, and my dad grabbed it and pinned it to my side. He gave a firm shake of his head to the auctioneer, and the man banged down his gavel and sold the bike to someone else. "What did you do that for?" I had asked my dad. "You were about to bid $250 for that bike," he answered. I gulped. "How can you understand what he's saying?" "I'll let you know how much the bidding has gone up to," he answered. And he did. When the next bikes came up he kept whispering the price to me as they went along. At every one I stopped at the $70, and somebody would outbid me. It didn't take long for everyone to figure out how much money I had to spend. They would bid $71 and I would be done. As time went on, it looked like it wasn't going to be my day. All of the bikes that were worth riding kept going for more than I had. Of course the crowd did thin out a bit with a number of kids leaving with their new bikes, but there were still a lot of people there. Then the auctioneer brought up my dream bike. She was beautiful. Her silver chrome gleamed in the sunlight until she sparkled. In the back of my mind I wondered what she would go for. As the auctioneer described the bike, suddenly a small cloud blocked out the sun. Then a bit of rain suddenly began to fall. Unfortunately it didn't dampen anyone's enthusiasm. Just for fun, I bid on the bike. I bid $50, and it quickly went up. I got another bid in at $70 right when that rain cloud decided to dump its load. It was the strangest thing. It was a bright sunny day, then suddenly it was pouring down rain like someone was standing over us with a water bucket. Right after that the lightning started. Some guy off to the side yelled $73 as he ran for cover. I knew my bidding was over, so I turned to go inside. Then from right next to me I heard $75. My dad had actually bid on the bike. The auctioneer wanted to get out of there as fast as everyone else, so he quickly slammed down his gavel and yelled sold. That's how I got the bike I always thought I wanted. For the first couple of days, You couldn't pry my seat from that bike. I rode it everywhere I could. It was summer and school was out, so that bike and I would spend the whole day together. Then came Wednesday. I was hurrying home as fast as I could. It was getting dark and I knew I was late for supper. My mom was going to scream. This would be the second time this week. I rounded the corner of our street and could see my house ahead. I put on a burst of speed. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, a ghostly figure jumped out in front of me. He was about my age, but he was covered in bumps and bruises, and had blood spilling from a huge gaping wound on his head. But that wasn't the scariest part. The worst thing was, he was transparent. I could see right through him. "Get off my bike!" he yelled at me. I screamed in terror and threw my hands up in front of my face. Don't ever believe it when they tell you that the X314 steers itself. It doesn't. The handlebars suddenly twisted sideways and threw me into the street. As soon as I hit the edge of the gutter, the front tire locked. Of course, everything else had enough momentum that the front tire was the only thing that stopped. I cartwheeled over the handlebars. The next thing I remember was finding myself laying in the middle of the street. Everything hurt. My palms were stinging from where I had put my hands out to break my fall. Worse than that were my right knee and my left elbow. I knew they had taken the greatest force of the fall. I opened my eyes and looked around. I was clear out in the middle of the street. As much as it hurt, I knew I had to get up and get over to the side. If a car came around the corner too fast, they would never be able to stop in time. I tried to sit up, but it didn't seem to be working. Suddenly I was afraid that I had really screwed things up, and wouldn't be able to move my body for the rest of my life. I took a deep breath and tried to relax. Then I wiggled my fingers, then my toes. Everything seemed to be working okay. It hurt, but at least it was moving. I tried sitting up again, and that's when I realized I was caught in the bike. Part of it was underneath me and another part was on top of me. I kept struggling with it, trying to work myself free, but I was getting nowhere. Suddenly I looked over to the sidewalk where my tumble had started. There was that same ghastly figure standing there with a smirk on his face. He seemed to enjoy the trouble I was in. "Help me!" I yelled at him. "No," he answered back. "That's what you get for riding my bike." I didn't know what to say to that. I felt like it was my bike, but at the same time I didn't want to make him mad. Who knew what he would do? Suddenly I looked up and saw the headlights of a car rounding the corner. "You can have it," I screamed. "Help me." Suddenly the headlights screeched to a stop. The tires were inches from where I was laying. A second later a woman got out of the car. It turned out to be Mrs. Roberts, my next-door neighbor. "Oh, thank heaven you screamed," she said. "I didn't see you at first." "Oh my heavens, did I hit you? Please tell me I didn't hit you." "You didn't hit me, I promised. I had an accident. I'm stuck." Mrs. Roberts hurried forward and knelt down beside me. It took several painful minutes for her to get me untangled from the bike. I wiggled everything around once more to see if anything was broken. As far as I could tell, it wasn't. Mrs. Roberts quickly pulled her cell phone out of her purse. "What's your number?" she demanded. I gave it to her and she dialed the phone. A moment later she was explaining what had happened. A moment after that I looked down the street to see my father and mother both come running from the house. I've never seen my dad move so fast. He got to me in record time. I won't bore you with all the details about my trip to the hospital, and all the x-rays. I ended up with a broken wrist and a bunch of horrible-looking bruises. When I got back from the hospital I found out that my brother had wheeled my bike back to the garage. I was wishing he hadn't. He had brought the ghost back with it. Now this creep knew where I lived. He was standing there beside the bike, checking it for dents. I'm sure there were a few new ones, but I didn't care. It wasn't my bike. I knew that as soon as I could move without too much pain, I was taking that bike right back to the police station where I had gotten it. Hope you like this true scary haunted ghost stories. Please leave a like on this video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.